I'm Sandra Anfang of Rivertown Poets in Petaluma, California. We're here today to talk poetry with our guest, Fran Claggett-Holland. Let me tell you a little bit about Fran before we get started. Fran Claggett-Holland is a teacher, poet, and dog lover who loves to see other people's poetry dreams materialize. After nearly 60 years with her life partner, Fran is now dedicating herself to poetry in both a personal and a larger sense. She's grateful for the community that sustains her in her years not of retirement, but of heartfelt engagement with close friends and her poetry group, as well as other groups beyond Sonoma County. Locally, Fran is involved with the Redwood Writers, the largest writing group in California. Through that group, with Les Bernstein, Fran co-edits an annual poetry collection of members' writings. After many years of teaching at the high school and university levels, Fran taught poetry and memoir writing for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at Sonoma State. During her post-teaching years, Fran offered poetry workshops throughout the country, as well as in Guam, Panama, and the Virgin Islands through the National Writing Project. Fran's interest in brain research led her to develop new approaches to reading, writing, and thinking using metaphorical graphics. She's received many awards for her teaching and writing, including the Lifetime Achievement Award from the California Association of Teachers of English. Fran has written and co-written more than 5 nonfiction books for teachers and was the primary generator of California's writing test for students, a very new approach to assessment used by all middle school students. Fran and her partner, Madge Holland, team taught many students and worked together to establish the first humanities courses for high school students in California. Fran was also the first teacher to use the newly created Poets in the Schools program at San Francisco State. Her first poet was Adrienne Marcus, one of California's most prestigious poets. Fran has been fortunate to know a number of really fine, well-known poets. She and Madge met Robert Frost at the Breadloaf School of English, where he lived just down the path. In California, she also became well acquainted with Robert Duncan, Eve Merriam, and Carolyn Kaiser. She met others through her work with the National English Teachers programs and has stayed in close touch with several of her writing students. Fran's own poetry has been influenced by Wallace Stevens, who remains her favorite poet, among so many others, too many to name. Fran's poetry books include her latest, Under the Wings of the Crow, which includes new and selected poems, Blackbirds and Other Birds from Tory and Horn Press, Crow Crossings and the Consciousness of Stone, both from Risk Press, and Moments with Madge, Lux Aeterna, from the White Crow Press. Please welcome our guest, Fran Claggett-Holland. Fran, I'm excited to host you today as our guest. Your career as a writer and teacher sounds so rich and varied. Let's begin by talking about how and when poetry first entered your life. Was there a specific event or person that got you started writing, or was it more like gradually stepping into a river?
That's a really good question, Sandra. My first poem, I think, was written 10 years old in elementary school, and it got the school paper, which was really fun. Later, I always was interested in poetry, but it didn't really take hold on a permanent basis until I began teaching. And that is when I devoted my life to poetry. My students would come into my classroom once a week and bring their poems, and they would bring in a microphone, and we had our own poetry readings every week in my classroom. Of course, we had them during the day as well. My students would come into my class. I had a typewriter. Can you remember days when we used the typewriter? I had a typewriter in my classroom, and the kids would come in and start typing their poems right then, no matter what else was going on in my room, like other classes. But they were devoted to poetry, and I was devoted to poetry, and that's where it all started, in the classroom.
Great, thank you. I do remember typewriters. I actually own one. So you told us a lot about specifically what it was like in the classroom, but I'd love to hear more about your career as a writing teacher for high school and university students, as well as for older adults through the Osher Lifelong Learning Center. And how did you first become involved in teaching writing?
Teaching writing came naturally to me in the classroom because I taught English was the overall title for what we did, but humanities classes allowed us to specialize. So I specialized in poetry and the art and the music in our classroom. And my first book, really, Blackbirds and Other Birds, really came out of that early experience with my students. That goes way back. Before then, of course, I was writing for myself, but I wasn't publishing a lot. I published in the local journals, the teaching journals. I've always published in those, but I did not go beyond that area of teacher poet until much later. When I retired, I also taught at the University of California, and that was a wonderful experience. It was during the heyday of the violence that was going on in all of the colleges and universities in the late 60s and early 70s. And sometimes we couldn't even meet in our classroom because the cops were out there with their bayonets. But it was California and was quite active then. And my students also were extremely active politically. So they would take off for the day, either high school or college. They would take off and go work for where it was most needed. And they would come back with more poems. And we were the only group left on the campus of San Francisco State on the day that it burned, when the students, the Black League, took down the whole college. And here we were, high school kids and college kids, in a room, big room, with about 20 poets from San Francisco. And we kept on going, and the kids who were invading came up and asked what we were doing, and we said we were writing and talking about poetry. They let us go. We were the only group they allowed to continue when San Francisco went down that night. It was frightening because we knew that our parents of our students were watching television and seeing all this going on at the university, but we were okay. The next day, when class started, I thought the kids would be talking about the violence on the, they didn't. They came up and said, "What did you think about this poet or that poet?" And I thought, oh my God, they have heads for poetry, even in the midst of all this violence. So it has always been paramount for me to take into account what is going on in the outside world as well as in my poets' heads. I took them to coffee shops to read long before it was the thing to do. And Bernest, they just loved being the center of the attention, and they all had black books full of poetry, thick binders that they kept their poems in. And this was the keynote group of my group, and the ones I have stayed in contact with all these years, many, many years later.
Fantastic. So you were really on the cutting edge of important things happening. I didn't know that about the political aspect. So of course we need to be doing that again. And I think poetry is really connecting to the events of our current world, and all the racism and sexism and violence around that. That's very exciting to hear about. What was your experience like teaching writing in Guam or in the Virgin Islands and Panama? And how did you come to do that?
That was always surprising to me because I was so amazed at the teachers in those areas and how they really did not have any grasp at all of grammar or of the finer points of writing. So it was a real challenge, but they were all eager and willing to work and happy to have somebody there to guide them. So I loved my time with them. And it was, as I said, it was an eye-opener for me, because here are these people calling themselves English teachers, and they had no concept of a sentence.
Fascinating. You shared with me, Fran, that you're both a poet and a memoirist, and I think probably those kind of get mixed together form. Can you talk a little bit about what draws you to these somewhat different genres and how you move between them or merge them?
Actually, I merged them at San Francisco or at Sonoma State in the lifelong learning. I taught poetry and memoir. Sometimes I would talk about poetry as memoir or memoir as poetry, but they both always got in. I have a very specific plan for teaching a memoir course. And it is, I could just give them the plan and we work through it. Then they can choose to write either in prose or poetry from the plan that I work through with regard to memoir writing. I find many, many poems are really memoirs. When we talk about our lives and our inner lives and our outer lives, we bring up stories, we tell stories, and telling stories is the heart of all the memoir writing. So I love both of them, really.
Thank you, Fran. I agree with that. And so many, more and more for me, but for a lot of poets, I know that their drafts that become lineated poems often start as prose writing, memoir type, or journal writing, and then go different ways from there. Sometimes stay in that form and sometimes become lineated poems. Many writers have shared that they have periods where they don't write, periods in their lives that are kind of maybe not fallow isn't the right word, but periods where they're not writing, maybe doing other art forms. Has that been your experience, or have you written pretty much continuously?
Well, I've always had poetry around me and I've always taught poetry. As for my own writing, there were periods when I taught at the University of California because I had been a high school teacher, had 5 classes a day. Went to the University of California and had to be there 2 or 3 days a week. So I had all that time. And I wrote assiduously during that time that I was teaching at UC Berkeley. And so my first book, Blackbirds and Other Birds, really came to fruition during that time that I had to write. There were times that I was teaching so dedicatedly, so it took so much of our time. And my partner was also a teacher. We team taught, and we were very busy with our teaching. So there were times when I was not writing for myself very much, but it was always there, and I was teaching it. So I think I would say for people who are not sure what they want to do, just read poetry. Read it every morning. That's a wonderful time to read poetry. And now we have in our community, we have Larry Robinson who gives us a poem every morning. And I look forward to that. And Les Bernstein is also now giving a poem every morning to the people who sign up for her poems. So if we read a lot of poems, we will begin to see how we can shape our own poetry. And I think that has been a big bonus to us in this community.
I would agree with you about that. There are many others too. I receive a poem a day from several sources, more national sources, Poetry Foundation and others. But I didn't know about Les's, so I'm glad to know I will sign up for that. I've enjoyed Larry's so much and seen yours in there occasionally.
Right.
Are there other art forms you've played around with or put energy into, musical or visual art or any others?
Until I graduated from high school, I was really a pianist. I played the piano all the time. I studied piano. I was in a lot of recitals, and I have one poem in my latest book called Adagio Cantabile, which is about the second movement of the Beethoven Sonata Pathétique. And it was a very important poem, a very important poem for me to write because it was the first time I had really written about the experience of being at the piano and meeting Beethoven in my idealistic state. So I don't know how to answer that. I also took art lessons, and I did a few. I was never very talented about art, the painterly, but I was interested in it, and I did it anyway, even if I wasn't very talented there. My talent was in music in those days, and now, as you know, as you can hear, my voice is pretty much gone. I used to sing in all the choirs. I sang in my church choir, in my school choirs, in my college choirs. And now I cannot sing at all. And it's very, very depressing. So I'm
Mm.
sorry about that. I'm sorry you have to listen to my voice in its state now, because I did have a decent voice that you could understand, but now I know it's hard to hear.
Well, you're coming through loud and clear today. So even if it sounds that way to you, we can hear you and understand you. I
That's
noticed that birds, and specifically crows, loom large in your writing. Um, I too love the corvids. And have there been other thematic trajectories to your poetry?
Yes, I would say probably the mythology is the most dominant one that is throughout all of my poetry. I began in the 4th grade with my teacher, Mrs. Patterson, who was so wonderful. She introduced me to everything that's important in my life now: mythology, birds, the natural world. And it was a glorious, glorious year. And the mythology has followed me all my life. Almost all my poems, not all, but many, deal with some aspect of Greek or Roman mythology. I did not understand, I did not have access to the mythologies of the other part of the world until much later, but that also became important to realize. Every community, every country, every people have their own mythologies, and they're all important. So what Demeter, Persephone keep appearing in my poetry, as do many of the other mythology components.
Interesting. I think a lot of us, well, we got started on Greek and Roman young, probably middle school or younger. But any other particular cultures, mythologies that you like to write about or are inspired by?
Not really, because they are so embedded in my background and my history, my personal history. They're
Mhm.
the ones that come up most. I'm interested in all of the other mythologies. I think somebody said there were 21 stories of Cinderella around the world.
I believe
Every
it.
country has its own version of Cinderella, and some of the other ones too. But as far as I'm concerned, it's pretty much the Greek and Roman that come into my own mythology. And Sappho comes in a lot too,
Mhm.
logical or true to life as she was. She comes into a number of my poems.
So, what have you been working on lately, Fran, during the pandemic?
Well, there are a number of poems that have come out of the pandemic in some way or another. One of them comes out of an Adrian Rich quotation that begins, "In times like these, we must talk about trees." So I wrote a poem about how we are overwhelmed and terrified and so forth. And then I move into mythology, to the story of the myth where the woman turns into a tree, and talk from her viewpoint about what it is like to be a tree and how that can help us in our current situation as we learn how to adjust to a changing world, because our world has changed. There's no question about that. And I have another poem about the fences, how the fences don't hold during these catastrophic events that we have been going through. So I wouldn't say that it's a major part of my writing, but I would say that some of my most important poems to me have come out of our current situation: climate change, pandemic, all those things that are tearing our world apart, but they're also opportunities and challenges for our own growth.
I would agree. Did you want to share a poem, maybe a recent poem?
Yes, I would be happy to do that.
Good.
I would like to share one that isn't quite so recent, but I've often said to people who are writing, we all have families, one way or another. We have important relationships with our mothers. And I say that every poet has to write at least one poem about his or her mother. And I have a poem about my father, and my mother kept saying, "Where's my poem? Where's my poem?" Well, here's a tiny poem for her called "Moving into Language." We walk on the bones of our mother, shape earth's silence into elegy, mourn the lost words that lie with her, searching for our own lost song. Another aspect that is very strong in my poetry is building on other people's words, other poets. I turned, as you noticed, to Adrian Rich, and I have a poem for Dylan Thomas called In My Craft. He has a poem called In My Craft and Sullen Art. So my poem is simply called In My Craft. I am not driven as Dylan was to dye the green long days and sing them into poetry. I do not know how he saw those eyes, morning into afternoon, rising beyond the pale into words, or how, singing rage, he cast his grief into the arms of all the grieving lovers, old in dream and young enough to weep into the waking of their years. I do not know how Dylan lived his sullen art, nor do I know how, silent and unannounced, my quiet poems appear, pale against those spewing words that sing one sung inside my blood. I know your music, Welshman, carry the calls of those dark minds in my hands, and yet I do not rage. I listen to the morning in my craft and quiet art. I was born in Ohio in a tiny little coal mining village. So when Dylan talks about the coal mines, and we went to visit where Dylan Thomas grew up, and the coal mines were very much a part of my personal heritage. And that's how they got into that poem.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Yeah. So
Is there anything else that you'd like to add to the discussion that we haven't thought of?
I think we've covered most things.
Okay, maybe read one more poem then.
I'll read you another small poem.
Okay.
I'm a dog lover, as you mentioned at the beginning, and I have my 2 sighthounds. This one is just a simple little poem called Until. Your story is not my story. Your dog is not my dog. You loved your dog. He was the best dog in your world. I loved my dog. He was the best dog in my world. We grew old. I had to keep living. He wouldn't know what to do without me. I had to keep living, so he would keep living. That's how it was. Suddenly he grew old faster, as did I. One day he just laid down and died, as did I. My dog is not your dog. Still, your story is not my story until it is.
Oh, that's beautiful and a good one to end on. In the second half of our program, we'll be listening to Fran share some of her poetry. So look for that one on our YouTube channel. Fran, it's been a pleasure talking with you today and hearing some of your poems.
It's been a pleasure having you to talk to. I love to talk about poetry.